Last night, we were hearing that he might not come. So it was a relief to see him actually on the podium and to see that he's here and that he's committed enough to come to the table and start to negotiate. We heard the president say today that the U.S. will act, that we will stand behind our commitments as a country. But what we didn't hear today was how. How is the U.S. going to stand behind these commitments? The last time that the U.S. put forward numbers and promised to act on climate change, we didn't follow through. We didn't join the treaty. And so it's really important that the world get some assurances this time around that the U.S. is really serious about this, especially when we come out so strongly asking for other countries to be transparent and stand behind their actions. We really need to hear from the president that this is going to be a legislative priority for him. The whole world knows that the U.S. Senate hasn't acted. The world knows that they need for the U.S. Senate to act, and so we need to hear from the president that he's going to put his full weight behind making sure that this is a priority and that climate legislation in the U.S. passes as quickly as possible and is prioritized immediately after healthcare legislation. We didn't get that assurance today, and so we're still waiting for that assurance. We're also looking for, from the U.S., some assurances about how we are going to get to where we need to be in terms of emissions reductions. We found out from a leaked document yesterday from the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that even with all the targets on the table, assuming that everyone goes to the high level of their targets, we are still not where we need to be in terms of ensuring the survival of the most vulnerable people and ecosystems in the world. So the question we all have to ask ourselves now is, how are we going to make up that difference? How are we going to make up the gap? Every country needs to do more now than they thought they were going to do because the pledges that we've put forward simply aren't enough. So we're waiting to hear from the president how we're going to close that gap. What are the additional reductions we can get in addition to that legislation? So in addition to that promise that we're going to follow up on legislation, we have got to have a clear signal about how we are going to close the gap. The U.S. came forward with a financing proposal yesterday, which it was very, very good to finally hear a commitment to long-term finance. We're also seeing that there's a commitment to short and medium-term finance, which are good signs and can get additional reductions, but it's not yet on the scale that we need to solve the problem. There are countries suffering enormous impacts today, just as we are suffering them in the U.S. And we didn't really hear a commitment to helping countries that are facing these impacts and to really focusing on adaptation or the preparation for the impacts of climate change. So we do need to refocus our efforts in that regard. We also need to make sure that other countries follow up on on the moves that the U.S. has made. We saw the finance proposal from the U.S., so is that going to trigger additional actions from other countries? Could we have the EU move to the high level of its conditional target now? Because again, we need for those additional emissions reductions to happen. Every single country that has a conditional target needs to move to the high end of that target, and the big countries like the U.S. who have put forward numbers need to be willing to recognize that we're going to all have to do more. And so what we really need is a clear commitment to a quick science review to assess where we are as a global community and to get to additional reductions. We need to make sure that science review is tied to the IPCC, the scientific body that can tell us whether or not we are on track. We need to be able to revisit what we agreed to in Copenhagen. We need to make sure that it's legally binding and it's a treaty and there's draft treaty text behind it. All of these things are assurances that we still need from the President of the United States.